border walls. They're one of the most volatile political phenomena of the 21st century, and yet the boundaries that give them form are only a few hundred years old. In Europe, they were established by Westphalian sovereignty in the 1500s and 1600s. Everywhere else, these borders were imposed only in the last couple hundred years, through colonization and the involuntary imposition of European colonial practices on the global south. Most walls and fences constructed on these newborn borders initially reflected the conversion of a conflict's front line into a de facto border, freezing a zone of tension in a fortified and artificial peace. However, there were less than a dozen of these barriers worldwide at the end of the Cold War, and since then over 60 fences, blockades, and walls demarcating sovereign boundaries have been erected for a variety of stated reasons. Perhaps the most notorious of these newly constructed border barriers, which can help explain the purpose of scores of others, lies roughly upon the 30th parallel in the Western Hemisphere, from San Diego, Tijuana in the west to Brownsville, Matamoros in the east. This border, separating the United States of America from the United Mexican States, stretches over 3,000 kilometers, yet only had approximately 100 kilometers of fencing prior to 2006, all of which had been constructed since the 1990s. Since then, the United States has built around 1,300 kilometers of walls, fences, and other fortifications along the border, with the rest of the boundary being taken care of by natural features, namely the Rio Grande. In light of this worldwide phenomenon of border securitization, just one question begs to be asked. Why does the United States-Mexico wall exist, and how can it explain the rest of the borders across the world? "150 Years of Division. It all started in 1848, when, after a bloody war, the United States forced Mexico to cede nearly half of its territory in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, before the U.S. bought more Mexican land just 5 years later with the Gadsden Purchase. Though these moves established the modern-day U.S.-Mexico border on paper, communities that this border had just split in two would continue to exist for many years as if they weren't divided at all. The first major effects of the border would not come in the form of migration, or terrorism, or trafficking. Rather, they came in the form of an enclosure movement. After the annexation of the southwestern United States, white, English-speaking settlers flocked to the region, privatizing the previously open lands and proletarianizing the local population. This forceful American colonization helped define which territory belonged to the United States and which territory belonged to Mexico. Because of the enclosure of the American frontier, the two sides of this imaginary U.S.-Mexico line all of a sudden had diverging economies, triggering another phenomenon that would define the two nations' relationships at their connection for the next century: smuggling. During the United States' Prohibition period of the early 1900s, smuggling operations popped up across the border. Various groups either brought alcohol from Mexico to the United States or encouraged Americans to come over to Mexico to get the good stuff from the source. When alcohol was legalized, these infrastructures still remained in place, shifting their focus to narcotics instead, many of which are still heavily trafficked across the border today. Although the U.S. Border Patrol was formed in 1924 with a mission of preventing this cross-border smuggling, their poor funding and the thousands of kilometers of open space along this boundary meant that they had little success fulfilling their stated purpose. It wasn't just material goods crossing this border that drew the ire of the United States. During World War II, the United States established the Bracero program, bringing in Mexican guest farm workers to replace the men who had gone off to war. Even though the program ended after a couple decades, its infrastructure remained in place, and Mexican workers continued to come across the border seasonally for jobs that had been earmarked for them. Only now, these workers were labeled as illegal immigrants. In essence, the Mexican workers stayed the same, but the American policy towards them changed. In addition, globalization, through free trade agreements and capitalist investment, led to huge surges of trade from low-wage Mexican factories into the United States and cheap American corn into Mexico. This enabled the rapid growth of cities on both sides of the border, as well as the impoverishment of the rest of Mexican society. The increase in activity at the boundary between the two nations encouraged further increases in both undocumented immigration and drug trafficking. By the end of the 20th century, all this growth in officially unsanctioned activity at its southern border had put the United States on notice. They passed laws like the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986 and undertook operations like Blockade in 1993 and Gatekeeper in 1994, signaling that America was now taking its border seriously, and this would have consequences. However, during this period, the United States' barrier-building operations were making slow progress. Though large sections of the U.S. population supported other security measures, large-scale wall building wasn't exactly popular due to the lack of an immediate threat to U.S. sovereignty, negative associations with the Berlin Wall, and overall a lack of faith in such an extensive and expensive project. But all this changed after a single event, the September 11th, 2001 attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. Let me explain why.
Border walls and the War on Terror.
In the book Border Walls, Security and the War on Terror in the United States, India, and Israel, Rhys Jones argues that the line on the map and the barrier on the border bring the idea of separate homogeneous territories and separate homogeneous peoples into being. In the case of U.S.-Mexico, the border barrier took the fuzzy line between who was American and who wasn't and made this line clear and defined. The United States' conceptual national identity, which had been coming to life over the past 200 years, was thoroughly reinforced through wire and steel. In his book, Jones realizes that the state apparatus deliberately manufactured and manipulated Americans' fears of terrorism, drugs, and immigration to reify its sovereignty and control over its territory, whilst creating an enemy that it would heroically combat, winning the favor of its subjects in the process. After 9/11, the United States' image of national pride was heavily reinforced, while its enemies were deterritorialized and painted as irrational villains. The good versus evil rhetoric pushed by politicians across the political spectrum was the key justification for the so-called War on Terror and the immense securitization measures that came with it, including the border wall. After the Middle Eastern front of the War on Terror began to stall, both Democrats and Republicans turned south to the U.S.-Mexico border, where lawlessness needed to be clamped down on and the homeland needed security. They claimed evil was flooding through the permeable, unobstructed border and that a barrier was the only way to stop this traffic. In 2006, the Secure Fence Act was passed, paving the way for over 1,000 kilometers of border blockades to be built in just a few years, asserting American sovereignty through the impermeable definitiveness of steel. Another interesting aspect of not just America's borders, but all nations' borders, is how they contribute to continual securitization through a form of circular logic. In the conclusion of Jones's book, he writes that none of the barriers come close to completely sealing the borders of the country. Instead, the gaps that become evident are held up as examples of why the state needs to be ever more vigilant about security. In this way, barriers at the borders will never be good enough, which means that the state can claim that they must continue to act outside the law in order to protect their people. It becomes engaged in an endless loop of security spending, elimination of civil liberties, and border internalization. Jones sums up his argument with the following passage. The construction of a barrier on the border simultaneously legitimizes and intensifies exclusion by providing a material manifestation of the abstract idea of sovereignty, which brings the claim of territorial difference into being. Once the boundary is marked and the container of the state takes form, the perception of difference between the two places becomes stronger. By performing sovereign control, the state simultaneously reifies authority over that territory and defines the limits of the people that belong there. These perceived differences then fuel more passionate feelings of belonging to the in-group and distinction from the other on the outside. In the decade plus since Rhys Jones published Border Walls, many new developments have occurred at the U.S.-Mexico border that suggest his argument hit the nail on the head. For starters, Donald Trump won the 2016 and 2024 presidential elections on the back of his promises to build the wall, a quest to reinforce and fully control the United States' southern boundary. This fully backs Jones's assertion that the border would always be viewed as permeable, no matter how fortified it was. In the next two elections after Trump's victory, even the supposedly progressive Democratic nominees for U.S. president staked their campaigns on increasing border security by hiring more Border Patrol officers and investing in surveillance technology. Additionally, the key narratives of terrorism, illegal immigration, and drug trafficking that Jones laid out have continued to be utilized in the border militarization justification. For example, the U.S. Customs and Border Protection Budget Overview for 2026 states in its opening line that CBP is responsible for securing America's borders to protect the United States against terrorist threats and to prevent the illegal entry of inadmissible persons and contraband. Jones's theories and border walls are more or less completely accurate reflections of the reality at the US-Mexico border. His analysis of how American institutions use fear to reinforce national sovereignty and create an enemy that must be excluded ring wholly true, especially today. However, there's one question that his theory on border walls leaves open to interpretation. What do they have to do with class?
Class politics at the border.
It might seem strange to associate border wall politics with class politics, given Jones's presentation of borders as a conflict between the state and the people, not the employers and the employees. However, given how heavily the United States has already obscured its true motives for securitization, it's worth considering whether there's more at play here. After all, one of the most well-documented ways that support for border securitization is inserted into the political agenda is through a trick targeting the workers who find themselves at the lowest rung of the socioeconomic hierarchy, the blame game. In recent years, billionaire-backed US politicians and media networks have consistently spouted claims that illegal immigrants are crossing the border and, en masse, stealing jobs, starting gangs, selling drugs, killing people, committing terrorism, yada yada yada. A glaring example of this insidious effort to divide working class people can be seen in a recent Department of Homeland Security tweet that writes, "Rent is too high. There are tens of millions of criminal illegals in our country. Groceries cost too much. There are tens of millions of criminal illegals in our country." And it just continues like this for a bit. "I can't afford a car. There are tens of millions of criminal illegals in this country. I can't afford a house. There are tens of millions of criminal illegals in our country." Not only do narratives like this feed into the perpetual border securitization self-justification loop, but they also serve to divide the working class along the lines of nationality. The division and mistrust sown by border rhetoric and cultural polarization leads many working class Americans to abandon class struggle altogether, believing that the true perpetrators of their misery are the criminal illegals who cross the border. Those truly dominant in US society, the corporate, capitalist, bourgeois elite, are able to play working people off each other and ensure their power remains largely unthreatened. Therein lies the true plot of border walls, with all the charades and mirages pushed aside. They are one of many devices employed by a large, sophisticated apparatus of capital, which seeks to divide working people into nations, not just through socially constructed identities and economies, but through physically constructed walls and fences of iron and steel. Border barriers reify the boundaries of state sovereignty, quell questions of the state's authority, and severely hinder intersectional worker cooperation against the capitalist state. A stark challenge now falls upon working people of all nations. In order to one day break down the barriers that so jarringly divide us, we must reach across the formidable lines of sovereignty and forge lasting connections with our class siblings on the other side. At the US-Mexico border, this process involves American workers humanizing and building relationships with the Mexican workers who are impoverished by the capitalist system and the refugee workers who came from all across the world fleeing the catastrophes that it created. In order to overcome the cards stacked against us, workers of all stripes must stand with any group who US politicians and media moguls try to scapegoat as terrorists, criminals, job seekers, or whatever. By forging international solidarity, the working class will take a key step in breaking down the border barriers that keep our elite enemies in power. Only when the walls come down will liberty and justice truly emerge. Thank you for watching.